Hi everyone. So, with my last video on the fall of Bashar al-Assad, I mentioned there'd be more to say on this. There's of course a lot more to say, but there's just a few things I want to touch on. I want to touch on the immediate future and concerns around Syria, because whilst there is a lot of optimism and genuine jubilation at the end of this ghastly regime, there will also be fears, and I want to touch a bit on that. I also want to address those people who shamefully defend the Assad regime, some of them in the West. Um, so Assad's lucky that he's alive, quite frankly. You know, other dictators have had violent ends. Saddam Hussein was executed, Gaddafi was basically lynched. Um, in Romania, going further back, the Ceausescu's were executed. So Assad and his family should consider themselves lucky. They're going to probably live out their days in a Moscow compound. Um, but I think that from a Western perspective, there's some things to consider with this. It's clearly been a huge humiliation for the Russians. It's been a huge humiliation for the Iranians and for Hezbollah. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that's 3 plus points because all three are malevolent influences in the region, particularly Russia and Iran. So the fact that they've been basically made redundant is a good thing. It's not that the West has come across strong either. You know, I'm under no illusions. It wasn't the West that ousted Assad. So it's not that the West is necessarily looking triumphant either. But Russia has long had a malevolent influence in the region. So has Iran. So the fact that they've been weakened, and that's definitely a positive thing. Um, for years, you know, Assad was propped up not just by Russian military force, but also by the significant influence of Russian state propaganda in the region and indeed around the world. So millions of people were taken in by this narrative that Assad was simply an embattled president fighting extremists. But that narrative is a distortion of the reality. It's true that there are Islamists on the ground in Syria. Of course, there are. We know that ISIS, Daesh, ISIL, whatever you want to call them, um, you know, made their headquarters in Raqqa in about late 2013. Their barbarism certainly rivaled the regimes, if not, it's even worse. I mean, this was truly ugly, ugly, brutal conflict because you had the Syrian people basically tormented by both sides. You had the brutality of the regime on one side, a regime that used chemical weapons and dropped barrel bombs on children, and then you had the depravity of ISIS on the other. You know, a terrorist bunch of thugs that would put men in cages and drown them, throw gay men off buildings, sexually enslave women. I mean, this is it's hell. It was hell on earth. Syria really was hell on earth the past decade. It was an extremely costly war. Estimates are anything from 300,000 to 600,000, which makes it one of the deadliest conflicts of modern times, basically. Devastating conflict. It's going to take years to rebuild that country. You know, many Syrians have been deeply impoverished by this. Um, so it's going to take a long time to rebuild that country. I think it's right that the British government's showing some caution. Starmer has been advised, you know, he welcomed the fall of this barbaric regime, and I think he was right to use that language because that's exactly what it was. But he's also right to be cautious with HTS, this Islamist group that was the main component of the collective rebels that moved into Damascus. You know, their leader, basically, they were another front for Al Qaeda. So it's right that there's Western concerns about that group and not just in the West. There'll be some Syrians understandably concerned about it. Christians, Shia Alawites. Assad was an Alawite. There will be perhaps some fears about revenge killings, perhaps, of Alawites because, you know, of their connections to Assad. Um, Many regime soldiers either defected or are now on their way to Iran as refugees. It's going to be a concerning time for the Kurds because of Turkey's significant role in this. So what will Turkey do in Kurdish-controlled areas? That's going to be a big concern for them. So whilst the removal of Assad in itself is a good thing, it's certainly far, far too early for complacency. I think the Syrian people should be allowed to enjoy this moment of jubilation. You know, many people are going through the prisons. There's underground complexes, I understand. One of the most sadistic was Sednaya Prison, um, where apparently between 5 and 13,000 people were killed in that prison in just a few years. That's absolutely horrendous. It was known as a slaughterhouse. So I hope I hope people could be reunited with the loved ones. In some cases, people have been languishing in those prisons for decades. I read about one man who was in the Syrian army and he refused to bomb the city of Hama in 1980. This was under Hafez al-Assad, his campaign against Islamists at that time. But like his son, you know, his campaigns caused a lot of civilian deaths. And because he refused to bomb that city, he has been languishing in prison since 1980. And there'll be many similar cases to that. I heard about one man whose memory is gone. He's been totally made a ghost by his experience. Um, I think there are risks in Syria with revenge. So it's going to be very, very important to get a balancing act between. I don't think that there should be a situation where people who have engaged in war crimes, for example, regime loyalists who have, like the Sabiha, for example, if those individuals are found and arrested, they have to be held to account for the crimes against humanity. Because if they're not, then resentment is just going to fester. You know, if you have had family members killed or tortured, and you see the killers and the torturers just walking free, it's just going to, that isn't a way to get reconciliation. So the guilty must be punished. However, that should also apply to any rebel leaders who have been involved in massacres or crimes against humanity. And like I say, this group HTS, it's basically just another front for Al Qaeda. No doubt they will have engaged in severe human rights abuses as well. Are they going to hold themselves to account? Of course not. So if they mean what they say, that they're going to respect minority rights, they have to prove that they're going to govern for all Syrians. And the way to do that is to show that they're holding consistent standards across the board. Now, many people have said this is going to be a repeat of the Taliban in Afghanistan. You know, when the Taliban took over in 2021, they said that they'd changed, they said they'd moderated, and of course they haven't. You know, women are basically prisoners in that country. The Taliban are as bad as they ever were. In the case of Syria, I don't think it's exactly the same. Syria is a much more urban population, and certainly, at least before the war, it was more educated. Afghanistan always had a high level of illiteracy, and it was more of a tribal culture. Syria is a more urban society by comparison. I think there are differences, but 13 years of war has deeply impoverished that country. Syria is now one of the poorest countries in the world, so it really is going to take a long time to rebuild. Um, Clearly, it would be wrong to just go in and start talking to HTS and treating them like a normal party. But at the same time, we may have to look at realpolitik. We may have to, I don't know if redesignating them from being a terrorist group would be practical or not. That would be, you know, bitter for many because they are an Islamist group. They're certainly not pro-West. But if they mean what they say, if they have genuinely reformed, and you know, I'm not naive, I would be very, very cautious about that. But the onus is on them now to prove that they could govern for all Syrians. Other key players in the region, certainly Turkey, Qatar, are watching the situation very closely. Israel will be watching it very closely. If Syria can be a rare success story in the Middle East, that would be a wonderful thing. But it's far, far too early to tell. I mean, it's only been a couple of days since Assad fell. I don't think you can remove. It isn't even Assad Jr., you know, his 24 years in power. We're talking about a dynasty that's been in power for 54 years. It's a very long time. So to remove that legacy, it's going to take years and years, probably decades, for that country to really rebuild. I think the Syrian people should be allowed to enjoy this moment. I I absolutely don't take anything away from them. They have every right to be jubilant. But what's been interesting is men and women have been on the street. People are genuinely overjoyed. And this is a region that has very little happiness. It's a region that has seen so much pain, so much struggle with war, with sectarian strife, with severe human rights abuses. And the Assad regime was one of the very worst, not just in the region, I would argue, in the world. Um, there's a few things that are important. If Russia thinks that they're going to sort of embolden Assad from abroad, if Assad thinks he can ever make some sort of return to Syria, I think that illusion should be shattered. Clearly the Syrians hate him. Most Syrians do. Also, even the regime loyalists, they will find, well, where was he when we were defending Damascus? He fled the country. So they were abandoned by Assad, and they should remember that. Um, I think that if Russia sort of was to prop up any sort of, let's say, pro-regime insurgency from abroad, Russia will find itself utterly despised in the region even more than it already is. So if Russia had any sense, they will just keep out of it at this point. They've given Assad shelter that will already make them unpopular, but at least he's not in Syria. At least his regime can no longer torture dissidents. At least his regime can no longer brutalize its own people. But it's up to HTS and other commanders to show that they offer a better alternative. Because if they just start persecuting minorities, if they start Talibanizing Syria, then they'll be no better than Assad. I don't actually think that will happen. I'm cautiously optimistic. I don't think the HTS will just be another Taliban. I mean, I don't trust them. They're an Islamist group, but sometimes it's a case of what's the lesser of two evils. I don't know. But certainly, I know Syrians who are actually now talking about returning to the homeland. So any right wingers in Europe should welcome this. They're always talking about mass migration to Europe. Well, if Syrians now return to the homeland, that will be, that will lower certainly immigration from Syria at least. Um, I would have thought they would welcome that. But so just close this video with I mentioned, those who are apologists for the regime. I'm thinking one of the most prominent ones is Tulsi Gabbard. She was asked about this. I do think the framing of the question is wrong because over the years, CNN journalists have asked her, "You don't think that Syria is a threat to American security?" That's the wrong framing of the question because um, it kind of allows Gabbard to say, "Oh, this is about American foreign wars, and we need to get out of forever wars," and to pitch her argument as a pacifist one. I don't think that's genuine pacifism at all to appease tyranny. I think that's non-pacifism actually, because being a cheerleader for dictators like Putin and Assad, that's not a peaceful position. That's not saying, if you're genuinely taking a pacifist point of view, you'll condemn all warmongering. You won't just cherry pick when the West is involved in military campaigns, as she does. Then there's the likes of the Stop the War coalition. Um, Around the time of the Iraq War, I very, very briefly was sort of sympathetic to them. I thought they're another front against this disastrous invasion, and I stand by my decision to oppose the Iraq War. I did at the time. I actually, this isn't just hot air. In 2003, I took part in anti-war protests. I think what turned out in Iraq was a complete disaster. Bush and Blair made a complete mess of that by underestimating how long it would take that country to rebuild, underestimating the sectarian strife, and just assuming democracy would happen naturally. The same mistakes can't occur in Syria. It's a bit different because this time it's an internal Syrian operation, largely, that has removed Assad. It would be a tragedy if Syria's turmoil continues, but for the likes of Tulsi Gabbard and the Stop the War Coalition, and there are others, but I mentioned Gabbard, but she's now, a senior cabinet member. or will be. I think her position's an absolute disgrace. People who think that she's just being practical, that she's just wanting America to avoid forever wars, I would say, okay, she can take that position. She can say we shouldn't intervene militarily, but the big problem I have with Tulsi Gabbard is she cannot bring herself to condemn Assad's brutality. She cannot bring herself to condemn foreign dictators like Putin and Assad. I think that's morally indefensible for a senior American politician to be so weak, to be so morally bankrupt that she cannot just call out wrong for being wrong. Okay, because the evidence of Assad's brutality is extensive, absolutely extensive. Um, One of the worst things about the Syria situation is a lot of people have genuinely believed that everyone fighting against Assad, everyone who's anti-Assad in Syria, must be an Islamist. The truth is, many Syrians hate Assad. They also hate ISIS. Syrians I know are ordinary people. They're not fanatical Islamists, and they are not regime loyalists either. They're just ordinary people who just want some normality in their country. So when the likes of Tulsi Gabbard sort of smears all opposition as Islamists and pro ISIS and so on, I think she's just echoing Russian state propaganda. Yes, there are Islamists on the ground, but I would argue that they got emboldened by the fact that Russia and China refused to condemn Assad's brutality. If they had, if there'd been a united international front against Assad's excesses, and more to the point, one of my subscribers made this point actually. I apologize, I can't remember off the top of my mind. But if Assad himself had simply enacted reforms in 2011, he could still be in Syria. He could have made himself very popular. In 2011, when those protests were happening in Deira and other cities, what were they about? That was not an Islamist uprising. That was protests against high unemployment, against corruption, against human rights abuses. If Assad had simply enacted some reforms, and actually, when Arab Spring happened, there were some countries that recognized it. I believe some of the Gulf states did enact some reforms in order to avoid the fate of other tyrannies in the region. The truth is, there's no government in the Middle East, with the possible exception of Israel, and I say that cautiously because I'm very critical of some of Israel's actions recently. But there's no genuine democracy in the Middle East without some sort of authoritarianism. So when Arab Spring happened, if Assad had seen the bigger picture and thought, okay, I'm going to listen to these concerns, I'm going to enact some reforms, then maybe he would still be in power. Or at least he may have been voted out in a democratic election. Of course, that's not the nature of dictators. But, you know, he's never going to see his country again. It's a small price compared to what his victims have been through. That's entirely of his own making. Assad cannot blame anyone but himself. If he had simply enacted some genuine reforms, because the irony is, when he took over his father in 2000, he was seen as a moderator, a moderate. He was soft spoken, unlike some dictators. He's not really an eccentric character. He comes across, I'm talking from outside perspectives here, as relatively normal. Yet behind that facade is a very sinister character, a man who has no problem using chemical weapons and barrel bombs on children, who has some of the absolute worst human rights abuses anywhere in the world. So I always found something a bit sinister about Assad. The fact that he was soft spoken sort of hid that killer instinct, that sort of ruthless, brutal ruthlessness that he very much personified. Um, but if he had simply enacted reforms in 2011, he may have been voted out democratically, but he wouldn't be living in exile in Russia. Um, and that country could have been spared over a decade of brutal warfare. And another irony of this is that Islamist groups like ISIS probably wouldn't have managed to get the same foothold if, if Assad had listened to his own people. Why? Most Syrians would have backed Assad against Islamists. I genuinely don't think that ordinary Syrian people would have accepted the likes of ISIS, had it not been for the quagmire that was created by Assad's war. I say Assad's war because his brutal use of force triggered this war. It wasn't the West that started this, as some pathetically claim. The West took military action against Assad. The West also took military action against ISIS. I happen to believe that was justified. I believe David Cameron was justified in taking those approaches because, in the case of Assad, it was a response to his genocidal policies against his own people. In the case of ISIS, that was actually an external threat because ISIS had terrorized European cities. So I think David Cameron's Syria policy was justified. There's renewed focus now on Ed Miliband, who, as Labour leader, did not vote with airstrikes with the government. There's renewed scrutiny on that. Maybe he should have. Maybe Assad would have been removed long before now had he done so. But I will say that the events of the last few days, there's a few concluding points I'd like to make. It's been a humiliation for Russia. It's shown Russian weakness in the region. It's been a humiliation for Iran, likewise. It's been a humiliation for Hezbollah. As far as I'm concerned, that's all good. It also shames those like Tulsi Gabbard, Stop the War Coalition, and others who have spent a lot of the last 13 years basically serving as apologists for Bashar Assad. I know that Gabbard made a speech saying, oh, if he's committed abuses, then he should be held to account. She only done that under pressure. That's not what Tulsi Gabbard believes. I see her for what she is. She is an Assad apologist, and I think that is a disgrace for a senior American politician to serve as a cheerleader for a brutal foreign dictator. That's an insult to Assad victims. That is an insult. I mean, what I would say to Tulsi Gabbard, are you conflating children who have been killed in barrel bomb attacks with ISIS? Because that's what she seems to be doing. She seems to be suggesting that any Syrian who opposes Assad must therefore be an Islamist terrorist, basically just regurgitating the regime's propaganda. And yeah, there are Islamists on the ground. But like I say, I think they got traction. I think they got galvanized because Assad prolonged the war by not making reforms. If he'd simply made reforms in the first place, he wouldn't be in exile. He'd be living out his retirement in an apartment in Damascus. Um, just a former president. But dictators around the world need to look at this and seriously consider this is how dictatorships, most of them end up. So I would say to those other dictators across the Middle East, look at Assad's fate. Living in exile now, probably never going to see his home country again. I would say to them, enact reforms. Listen to your people. The more brutal you are, the more hated you will be, and the worse it will be in the long run. Of course, you're not going to watch this video, but it's just basic common sense. If you brutalize your own people, you're going to be despised. That's the lesson of Syria. At the moment, I'd say it's more good than bad. The removal of Assad is definitely a good thing, but HTS, they are an Islamist group, so it's right that the West is very cautious about this. I think Starmer's got the good right balance. He's called Assad what he is, but he's not rushing to endorse HTS. That's all he can do. Um, Time will tell what direction Syria takes, but HTS has to um, prove that they will respect the rights of all Syrians. And yes, there will be. It's important to hold the guilty to account, torturers, killers, and so on. But it cannot just be a case of copying the regime. So throwing, alleged suspects into prison to languish for years. They need a fair trial. There needs to be due process. Um, but a lot of this is rebuilding a country that's been utterly shattered. All the institutions of Syria have been shattered. Another thing I would point out, leaving aside the human rights abuses, is the sheer corruption of the Assad regime. I mean, it's pretty revolting, actually, that Asma Assad, who was born a British citizen, she bought Louis Vuitton luxury goods in Harrods, whilst her husband was torturing people in prisons. It's kind of disgusting. Um, so shame on her husband. and shame on their ghastly dynasty. Um, the hatred of which, the hatred of the Assads is exemplified by the fact Hafiz al-Assad's tomb was set on fire. Now, I'm not saying I justify that, but who am I to question it? This was a family that caused untold misery to the Syrian people for decades. No one, no one should question the Syrians for expressing their contempt for the Assads. Um, so I say it's mostly a good thing, but I do put in that air of caution. It will be a nervous time for Christians, for Kurds, for Alawites. So if there's evidence that they start being persecuted, um, then the West should speak up on that and call out HTS. Um, I would actually put a sort of I would put a sort of statement to HTS. We welcome the fall of Assad, but it's up to you to prove that you're going to respect minorities. Respect minorities, enact genuine reforms, and we may work with you. That may be practical. But I think overall it's good news. It's definitely more good news than bad news. Absolutely nobody be looking at Assad and thinking, oh, this is terrible that he's gone now, the Islamists are taking over. Because Assad's brutality, the misery he caused in that country was just, we're not talking here about an autocrat who was a little bit hardline and, occasionally stood up to Islamists. This was a man who brutalized millions of his own people, men, women, and children who had nothing to do with ISIS. So that's the reality. And that will be Assad's toxic legacy. And when, he's only 59, eventually when he passes away of natural causes, his obituary should record his legacy as being one of a brutal, corrupt dictator, because that's what he is. Bashar Assad done nothing good for Syria. It's difficult to see any positive legacy whatsoever.